My name is Victor Shelton. I am the State Agronomist and Grazing Specialist for Indiana. Today we're going to talk about using a new interim practice standard, annual forage for grazing systems. This practice is to be used to plant adapted and compatible species of annual forages that are most suitable for pasture or harvested forage use. You'll find that the purposes do overlap some, which is certainly not uncommon. The primary purpose for this practice is to provide or increase the forage supply to help balance the animal forage needs, especially during low or no production periods, and or to extend the grazing season. It can also be used to provide temporary cover to reduce erosion. It can also be used to help reduce excess nutrients in the soil, particularly phosphorus, and it can also be used to help improve soil health. We're going to talk about all these scenarios. This practice can be used on existing pasture, hayland, and cropland. It is not eligible for forest land or grazed forest. They must be planted as part of a grazing system forage budget. The producer must presently have grazing or ruminant livestock in need of additional feed. It cannot be used to grow forage to sell. It is not a means to plant corn silage. The practice also doesn't apply for the establishment of annually planted crops that are going to be harvested for grain, fiber, vegetable, or for oilseed. Like cover crops, all purposes will comply with other USDA policies as applicable, especially with RMA or other interested parties. Like all seedings, you'll need to make sure that there's no noxious weeds or invasive species included. And, of course, seed tags are required. Species to be planted will be selected and based on site, weather, and soil conditions present for the establishment period, and based on animal nutritional requirements with limited anti-quality issues. The animal forage preference document is a good reference based on the existing or planned animal species. You certainly want to make sure that the species selected will fulfill the intended use and need and type of management being utilized also. Pesticide carryover or residual will be reviewed and considered, and restrictions adhered to where applicable for the grazing livestock or harvested forage, and for the success of the species just being grown. Seeding rates and species to be used will be based and calculated with the Indiana 810 seeding calculator. Only species that are included in the calculator will be used. Just like the cover crop seeding calculator, there are some secondary species that are allowed, but only after the base mix meets the seeding calculator. These minor components can be added purely for additional diversity, and they should not constitute a competitive amount that would suppress the primary species. Follow the guidelines in the seeding calculator for secondary species if you use them. Any species not included in a primary or secondary list will require a variance. Grazing will be according to the conservation practice standard prescribed grazing, and livestock will be excluded until the plants are ready to be grazed. If it's going to be harvested for forage, then forage harvest management will be used. Annual forages for grazing systems needs to be planned in conjunction with pasture and hay planting, prescribed grazing, forage harvest management, nutrient management, conservation crop rotation, or residue and tillage management for no-till. Annual forages can be planted in the same field the same year as cover crops, just not at the same time. And we'll look at some examples in a minute. If utilized to reduce erosion or improve soil health, then a practice must be part of a soil health management system. Planned cover crops may be switched out for annual forage for grazing systems if all the planned cover crops resource concerns are met and it doesn't exceed the original payment rate, and the annual forage purpose can also be met, and if it doesn't exceed more than 40 acres. Let's look at the purposes of the practice and some examples. Providing forage is going to be one of the most used purposes for this practice. Whether the forage is utilized for grazing or harvested and fed later, annual forages can certainly help to balance out ruminant livestock dry matter and nutritional needs. The practice will often be used for multiple purposes at the same time. It is certainly possible to grow all of the additional forage that is needed to balance the animal forage needs and provide temporary cover and possibly other purposes all at the same time. This purpose is mainly to help balance the animal forage balance, especially during low production periods, and to help extend the grazing season. When animals are able to continue to graze, not only are inputs potentially reduced, but animals also harvest forages themselves and leave nutrients from manure at the harvest location. In predominantly introduced cool season perennial pastures, we usually get a dramatic decrease or drop in performance during the late July-August period. This is mainly because of heat and often drier conditions. Producers are always looking for ways to help increase performance during that time frame, which is often called the summer slump period. Annuals certainly can fill that void. We'll look today at several ways that they can be incorporated into a grazing system. Overgrazing during this time frame on those perennial pastures can reduce production the rest of the growing season and weaken stands. Grazing annuals makes a good option for that time, allowing you to maintain good residual forage heights until conditions improve, and can reduce the need for supplemental feed such as hay during that same time frame. Planting annuals as a primary crop to be grazed in the winter helps to extend the grazing season or open up some more opportunities to continue grazing instead of feeding hay or other feed. Grazing annuals can also help to provide a longer rest period for perennial forages, especially for stockpiling, and depending on the weather, can make a big difference in yield and help delay grazing until those forages have gone dormant. Grazing annuals in the fall and winter can provide high quality feed. It is adequate for growing animals and quite often cheaper than fed products. With a little planting and good moisture, weather, and soil conditions, it is certainly possible to graze sometimes even throughout the year. 810 certainly can be very useful when it comes to reestablishing new pasture, or especially when you're transitioning existing pasture to improved species or varieties. Most producers need every acre of pasture that they have. In reality, several are short on pasture because of stocking rates already, and would have a very difficult time with any pasture downtime. Early season existing forages can either be grazed or mechanically harvested in a field to be renovated. The pasture with sufficient regrowth can then be terminated with a non-selective herbicide, and then a summer annual monoculture or mix could be drilled into the hopefully terminated existing sod. It's hard to get a 100% kill on some perennial species, especially Kentucky Indified Infected Tall Fescue. So this scenario of spray, smother spray can work very well to make sure that you have eliminated as much of that previous vegetation as possible. The initial spraying will generally terminate most of it. The intermediate annual forage crop helps to smother some of the remaining plants and allow some time for the potential seed bank to sprout, and by the time the annuals are finished, a second termination of any remaining plants or newly sprouted seed bank plants can be eliminated and provide a much cleaner seed bed to establish improved species or varieties into. This type of scenario not only provides for a cleaner seedbed to reestablish these new forages, but that forage production that is needed to balance the animal forage need isn't lost, or is at least not as badly reduced as losing the entire season during reestablishment. This also takes pressure off the new stand and hopefully allows it more time to get established prior to being grazed or harvested the first time. There are several possible scenarios to accomplish this, and they differ some according to the species being planted and the best time frame to do the final new perennial planting. Accomplishing this in one season is a must sometimes. That scenario that we just discussed provides forage for livestock with less production loss, provides advantages of ensuring total termination of existing forage. It certainly has some potential soil health benefits, and it sets up the site for a good seeding time frame during that late summer period for cool season forage establishment. And ample time for those plants to get well established prior to being utilized for the first time the next season. This establishment period is quite often rushed, and it can be very detrimental to that new stand if it is. A slightly different scenario would be skipping that late summer planting option and instead planting an early fall winter annual crop. That could be utilized for forage in some cases that fall, provide cover over the site over winter, and possibly forage for the next spring, and then either planted back to that perennial forage then, or repeated, which could really help boost soil organic matter and soil biology. You know that soil biological diversity can certainly be advantageous when we're switching from cool season forages or directly from cropland to warm season forages and getting some mycorrhiza into that soil system that is more advantageous for the warm season forages that we want. In that case, we want to make sure that that summer annual mix is diverse, which is always a good thing, and we have a mix of different warm season annual grasses, legumes, and forbs when possible. That can also be followed by an annual forage or cover crop mix that is usually going to winter kill. And then the warm season forages could be no-till drilled into that during the winter, during the dormant period, ideally when the soils are frozen. Then you have a better soil biology for the warm season forages, less weed competition. You have that code seed treatment, which it likes, and frozen soils to keep or reduce the chance of drilling that seed too deep. That same scenario can also be used except with a spring seeding of the warm season species also. So there's lots of options. Lastly, very similar to the smother spray scenario we've already talked about, annual forages can be planted to eliminate or reduce the concern of autotoxicity when reestablishing alfalfa fields, all the while providing some fodder that is normally lost during that establishment period. Autotoxicity is normally found to exist in old alfalfa stands and can cause very poor establishment of new alfalfa seedlings. By terminating the existing stand and planting an annual forage crop between the stand being terminated and the new planting, autotoxicity can be reduced and provide you a cleaner slate to work from. For this type of scenario, an early termination of the existing alfalfa, perhaps maybe after the first cutting or before, and then planting the annual forage crop allows for a late summer alfalfa planting that is generally less stressed with weeds and plenty of time to get established before the next season. The autotoxicity is usually more of an issue the closer the termination date of the old stand is to the new planting. So an annual forage crop can provide that needed time in forage and possibly a good change in soil biology to help reduce the risk of the toxicity. A10 can be used as a forage crop after a winter grain crop, such as wheat. This could be utilized to provide forage for grazing or mechanical harvest, and probably sometimes is more feasible or practical, especially in some areas, instead of double crop soybeans. If an annual forage is planted instead of soybeans, you can usually increase diversity into the rotation. You have good potential to improve soil organic matter and soil health, especially if you use a diverse forage mix that can enhance the biological diversity where it's lacking. Most forage crops also provide more erosion protection and cover than soybeans, especially using species that have a good fibrous root system. The value of the forage crop can easily exceed the value of the double crop soybeans, and that forage crop may even boost the next season cash crop. A10 can be used as temporary cover on winter feeding areas and feedlots. In both cases, it can help control erosion, help reduce water quality issues from runoff, help smother pesky and noxious weeds such as prickly pigweed and gypsum weed, and provide some forage for grazing. This temporary seeding could also be utilized to help reduce phosphorus on the site if harvested and fed somewhere else. It can also be grown and utilized for some structure to help stabilize the site once it's used for winter use again, and still provide some usable forage. A10 can be utilized after silage harvest. The forage can be used to help balance the animal forage needs, plus control erosion after that silage chopping. This forage under 810 can either be grazed or mechanically harvested. If completed early enough, then a winter cover crop could follow this forage crop, or the seeding could have a combination of forages that would provide fall forage for grazing or harvest, and still provide winter erosion protection, and for perhaps even some forage for next spring. Occasionally, there's a need to remove or reduce excess nutrients from the soil. Excess nutrients quite often tend to be in fields that are closest to the barn or feeding areas. Planting a forage that will take up a generous amount of excess nutrients, especially phosphorus, can be beneficial in reducing the phosphorus levels in the soil. This is one case where grazing is probably not ideal because a very significant amount of the consumed nutrients are returned to the site through manure and urine. This is one of those circumstances where mechanical harvesting is probably more ideal. Nutrients are reduced due to forages being harvested and removed from the field and utilized somewhere else. Ideally, utilized or fed on a site where nutrients are lacking or could be better. Select species and time forage harvest for the most nutrient uptake to maximize the reduction. It may take a long time to see a significant soil phosphorus reduction. Anytime that you're adding diversity to a crop rotation or to a forage system, you are improving soil health. Principles on the left here focus on feeding soil organisms, so in increasing mycorrhizal fungi. Maximizing living roots certainly help to maintain or increase soil organic matter and enhance nutrient cycling. Maximizing plant diversity influences energy and carbon availability in the soil and increases the grazing buffet above ground and adds resilience and a host of other benefits. The two principles on the right focus on protecting the soil and soil life. To protect the soil from erosion, maintain or increase stable soil aggregates and soil organic matter, and buffer against temperature and moisture changes that stress plants and soil organisms. Some people call the fifth principle the cows or whatever livestock is out there grazing. They are certainly the above ground livestock that help support the livestock below ground. Livestock should be our main management tool whenever possible. You know, the rumen is an excellent microbe source. You feed it correctly and it will feed the soil and plants back. Most nutrients are returned to the soil in a good grazing system. A fraction of what is removed if it's cut for hay. Cows turn forages into urine and manure, which make those nutrients in a more available form. Adding additional annual forages to a grazing system or a cropping system is always a good thing. But it becomes even more important if you're trying to do some soil regeneration. On sites with very low organic matter or extremely low biology, the more we can diversify the plants growing there, keep living roots present, and keep the soil covered as much as possible, the more we're going to improve it. Strip mine reclamation sites can be improved a lot faster by following these soil health principles, but especially from adding more diversity and even ideally livestock. I've seen very poor strip mine ground turn completely around in just a few years following these principles. For this purpose, you want to use as much of a diverse seed mix as possible. Create seeding mixes whenever possible instead of using monocultures. Remember, diversity is king. If you're going to be seeding the field to a perennial warm season grass, like discussed earlier, use an annual mix to help jumpstart that mycorrhiza that's going to help it get going faster. A summer mix of something like brown midrib sorghum sudan grass, cowpeas, a millet, and sunflowers would be good. Use your imagination to maximize diverse cropping rotations, to provide forage or fodder for the livestock, and improve soil health at the same time. There are a few precautions that need to be mentioned, and they certainly can be easily managed around with a little care. The two most frequently reported animal health problems associated with summer annual grasses are prussic acid and nitrate poisoning. Prussic acid poisoning can occur in sudan grass and sorghum sudan hybrids, and even occasionally you'll see it where Johnson grass is growing in a field. Toxic levels of prussic acid occur most commonly after a frost or during a drought. Now, nitrate poisoning usually occurs when high rates of nitrogen fertilizer are used, and then a drought or sudden weather change occurs. High nitrate levels are especially found in the lower plant parts. We saw a little of this after the drought of 2012. The nitrate in plants harvested for hay does not dissipate as it cures, so problems can occur when the hay is fed. When turning especially lactating animals out on lush spring forage, supplement with high magnesium mineral blocks or mineral salt mixtures to reduce the incidence of grass tetany. This can also occasionally occur in the fall. If seed is treated with a fungicide or any other type of treatment, or herbicides or insecticides were used for the prior crop, make sure that you're following any grazing or harvest restrictions on that label. If in doubt of any concern, test prior to use and consult the Extension Service for any additional information. If you're going to graze it, it doesn't matter if the annuals are planted on pasture or cropland. Both are going to need some infrastructure. Good fences make good neighbors. External fences need to meet all local and state laws and ordinances and control the livestock that are present. Temporary fence is one of your most valuable management tools. Water is needed year-round. The amount utilized does vary, but should be planned for any season. In Indiana, that means it should be capable of delivering at least 30 gallons per day per animal unit. Plans for 810 should contain normal planting information, including field number, acres, and the species to be planted and rates. Seed tags are required, and inoculants should be used for any legumes planted. especially if they have not been planted recently. Sufficient information should be provided to ensure that the producer has enough information to get a successful stand and to be able to meet goals and purposes. This should include information or discussion on site preparation, proper seeding depths, rates, and certainly seeding dates. Evaluate stands and review with the producer to ensure that the crop meets the intended purpose or purposes. If undesirable plants invade the stand, then use appropriate management to control them. In summary, annual forages can play a huge part in providing forage during slump periods and extend the grazing season. They can be advantageous by providing forage and more opportunities when transitioning to new perennial forages. They can also be useful for reducing erosion, reducing excess nutrients, and most certainly improving soil health. Plant species that are most advantageous for the site, purpose, and the livestock that will be using it. This concludes this presentation about the Interim Standard 810, Annual Forages for Grazing Systems. If you have any questions, please contact your area or state grazing specialist.